Hi, this is Heidi Burgess. Today I want to talk about massively parallel, complexity oriented reconciliation. Before I explain what that mouthful means, I want to give a little bit of history. In 2003, we were just beginning to write Beyond Intractability, and we asked Chip House to write an article on reconciliation. He did, leading with the notion that reconciliation had become one of the hottest topics in the increasingly hot field of conflict resolution. He went on to say that when he wrote a book in 1995, reconciliation was not mentioned once. But by 2001, it was the most frequently cited concept. Then in 2017, I was going back over the various Beyond Intractability essays, looking to see which ones needed updating. At the time, I said that it seemed to me that his reconciliation essay was especially in need of updating because I was reacting to his observation that it had become a hot topic. I said it was not such a hot topic in 2017, although it badly needed to be. Well, it turns out that that wasn't entirely a fair statement. It depends where you look. I was looking primarily at political conflicts in the United States. This was a year after Donald Trump was elected president, and most of the attention was not on reconciliation between the red blue divide. Rather, on the left, the attention was being given to how to resist and how to win the next time around. This was true for the Republicans too during the Obama administration. They certainly were not looking at reconciling. They were trying to block absolutely everything Obama was doing and were trying to lay the groundwork for winning in 2016, which they did indeed do. Now, that doesn't mean that reconciliation wasn't going on. There was a lot of reconciliation and peace building going on, but it was mostly happening, at least to my knowledge, overseas. Lots going on in Africa, South America, Asia, Middle East. Most of the peace building organizations that I knew of were working in other places and weren't paying a whole lot of attention to what was going on in the United States. However, what I should have recognized when I said that reconciliation wasn't a hot topic was that all of this was going on abroad. I recently became aware of an article that was published in March 2019 by Simon Keyes that mapped reconciliation activities the year before. And he noted to talk about reconciliation is to join a crowded conversation in which hundreds of people are talking from different positions and in different languages. So rather than saying that reconciliation wasn't a hot topic, I should have made a much narrower statement that it wasn't a hot topic in the US, but it was very much a hot topic elsewhere. Keyes went on to say that there were 150 new articles on reconciliation just in 2018. 100 countries had reconciliation programs, and 90 had had truth commissions. So there was certainly a lot of activity going on, but it wasn't in the United States. And that's pretty much true now, but it looks like it's beginning to change. The run up to the November 2020 election got to be so hostile that there were organizations who specialize in predicting when violence is going to break out overseas and they were warning that violence could very well break out in the United States. There was a lot of talk about the need to cool the rhetoric and calm things down. And indeed, uh, Joe Biden tried to do that in his victory speech, where he said that he was going to be a president not for the left or the Democrats, but for all Americans. So far, unfortunately, the right does not seem to be embracing the same idea, but there's time. Now, there was an organization called the Bridge Alliance that's been in existence for quite a while. I couldn't find on their website a date when they were founded, but I know that they were founded before Trump was elected, and they were working actively and continue to do so, work actively in the United States to try to bridge the difference between conservatives and liberals. More organizations started to get on this bandwagon in the run up to the 2020 election. The Alliance for Peacebuilding formed a US working group, and if you go to their website and go to the URL that is shown on this slide, you'll find lots of resources on US peacebuilding. Books, videos, AFP statement, I should say news stories, anti-racism resources, and a very useful building trust handbook. All of this has been compiled and much of this has been written recently. Similarly, the Search for Common Ground is, I believe, the biggest peace building organization in the world. And until recently, they were not working in the United States. However, they now do have United States projects because they realize that there is need for peace building here too and reconciliation. So that was where I was coming from when I said reconciliation wasn't a hot topic. And I even reiterated that statement recently, but I'm going to correct it now, having seen Simon Keyes's article. So now I want to turn my attention to the question of what reconciliation is and what I meant by the terms that I put forth in the title, Complexity Oriented, Massively Parallel Reconciliation. When we originally started teaching this class, we showed this rather standard bell curve. You maybe have seen something like this before. This is a rather traditional notion about how conflicts develop. The notion is that tensions begin to grow, but they don't erupt. And when things are relatively quiet but getting tenser, you have what this graph terms latent conflict. And then there's a triggering incident and the conflict emerges. Usually it quickly escalates with increasing intensity over time and until eventually you get to a stalemate, or what Bill Zartman called a hurting stalemate, which is the point where it becomes obvious that neither side can win, but both sides are hurting or getting damaged by the conflict. This was the point that Zartman claimed was ripe for reconciliation or negotiation, because once both sides realize that they can't win and they're getting hurt, if rationality prevailed, they would negotiate. So the notion is that's when de-escalation happens, that's when negotiation happens. That's when you get dispute settlements and peace agreements. And it's only after this dispute settlement and peace agreement that you supposedly got what was called post-conflict peace building or resolution and reconciliation. When Guy and I first started teaching this class, it was called post-conflict resolution and reconciliation. And I made a bit of a fuss over the notion that nothing really is post-conflict, and very few things are really resolved. So when the name of the course got changed to simply reconciliation, I was pleased. I didn't have to make a fuss over that. But there still is a question as to whether reconciliation can ever be achieved and whether it can be worked towards before you have a dispute settlement or a peace agreement. Those are issues we will be talking about as time goes on. Let's look a little more carefully at this diagram. One of the problems with it is it has two different types of entities in it. It has what I called here status or situations, such as latent conflict or hurting stalemate, which are the way things are at a particular time. And then you have processes, conflict emergence, escalation, de-escalation, settlement, peace building. Those are processes. And those processes can lead to any number of end states, which you might say are statuses, that are technically different from each other, but are commonly used in the same way. Resolution, transformation, reconciliation, stable peace, what Rob Sigliano calls peace writ large, and I, somewhat tongue in cheek, added happily ever after. The notion is that with post conflict peace building and reconciliation work, you get to a point where everybody's happy. Everything is working the way it should be. Relationships are mended, structures are mended, everything is as it should be and peaceful. Some of these concepts are also processes. Reconciliation is a process, transformation is a process. So there's a confusion between status and process, and there's a question about how far you can get. One of the common problems is that you never do get down to the right side of that bell curve. If one side defeats the other instead of having a hurting stalemate, that tends to create repression and latent hostility, which will cause renewed conflict escalation, and the conflict will start over again. Even if you don't have the defeat of one side, if you do have a hurting stalemate and you do get de escalation for a while, if progress isn't rapid enough or one side thinks that it's not being treated well enough, you can easily get latent hostility and start the cycle over again. So in an earlier version of this video, Guy argued that conflict is actually a breaking wave, and you have to deal with all the stages simultaneously and be very careful to stay on your feet, or else you'll get very badly battered around. And then he drew a diagram that looked like this. So this is the schematic of the breaking ocean wave. And you just get caught in this circle of escalation, stalemate, de-escalation, escalation, stalemate, round and round. Unless you can come up with an exit option. Now, in the concept of reconciliation, what's the exit option? Well, usually it's peacemaking and peacekeeping, which aren't part of reconciliation, but they enable people and countries sometimes to get out of that vicious circle and to start following the blue arrow off in a better direction. And the key here is, can you keep on going off to the right in the blue arrow, or are you going to end up following that black arrow back into the circle? Again, in our earlier video, we likened this to a rocket taking off. When a rocket takes off, it has to reach a certain speed and certain height in order to break through the atmosphere and go into Earth orbit. So you can imagine escape velocity as being sort of similar to what you need to establish to get out of that vicious circle. So we continued with the multi-stage rocket metaphor when it came to reconciliation and peace building. Stage one was peacemaking and peacekeeping, which was not part of reconciliation, but you set you up so you got out of the circle, you escaped burst orbit, and you could go to someplace different and better. Stage two, we labeled as retrospective reconciliation, where you look backward at the harms done, or look down at the earth, if you want to keep on going with the metaphor, and you try to repair the damage and make things right. Stage three was looking forward. It was looking towards a positive vision of how to live together in the future. Stages four and five are implementing those visions. Stage four, implementing it at the interpersonal, intergroup level, and stage five, implementing it at the societal level. Well, all that seems to make sense, but there's a problem, which is that rockets are very complicated systems, but they're not like human systems, which are complex. Wendell Jones taught us back in 2003 the difference between complicated and complex adaptive systems. And this is a very important distinction. Complicated systems are determinate. The pieces are put together according to a plan and they work in a predictable way. That's not to say they don't break on occasion, but usually everything works as planned and you can predict what's going to happen. The relationship between inputs and outputs is linear, and again, it's predictable. Complex systems are indeterminate. And Wendell talked about flocks of birds as an example of a relatively simple, compared to people, complex system. Birds fly according to particular rules. There's usually a leader, and they have rules that they're supposed to follow the leader or the bird in front of them, but not get so close as to hit each other. But even when agents, which is what the individual entities in complex systems are called by systems theorists, even when agents act according to preset rules, the outcome is unpredictable. The relationships between inputs and outputs is not linear, and that's not predictable either. So sometimes one bird can make a small change, and that will send the whole flock off in a new direction. And sometimes there can be a big change, and very little happens. Again, in the earlier video, Guy went on to demonstrate this in a series of slides that showed pool tables. Now, this pool table has a whole lot of balls, but it only has one player. So the goal of that player is to hit balls one at a time, get them all in the pocket, and get all the balls to disappear. And if the player's good and understands physics, the player should be able to do that. Because in a complicated system, you can still predict if the ball is hit straight on, it'll go straight on, then it'll hit another one, which will go in a predictable way. And you can tell what's going to happen. This is a complicated system. A complex system is one where you have lots of people who are hitting balls, trying to affect where the other ones are going. And on top of that, all of the balls themselves are moving. You might notice that I started to put little arrows by some of these balls showing that they're moving on their own, and I decided that's ridiculous. It would take me all day to put in all the little arrows. But in a complex system, each one of the entities has its own decisions to make. It has its own decision rules, which in the case of birds are all the same, but in the case of humans, our decision rules are different. So you rapidly get a very, very complex system that adapts either well or badly to changes in its environment whenever those changes occur. Now, when you apply this notion to reconciliation, what you see is there's lots of different people and organizations who have different definitions of reconciliation. I just took 6 definitions out of Simon Key's article. Some people think that reconciliation is the building of new narratives. So one of the players in this pool game is trying to build new narratives. Someone else is trying to establish new social norms. John Paul Lederach tries to balance peace, truth, justice, and mercy. Others emphasize shared visions. Others emphasize changing relationships from negative relationships to positive relationships. Rob Resigliano talks about changing structures, attitudes, and transactions at the interpersonal and at the societal level. So you have lots of different images of what reconciliation is, and complexity-oriented reconciliation says all of them are right. It's not that one's right, it's not that one's wrong, but you have to do all of those things to get to reconciliation. And you have to do it at the interpersonal, intrapersonal, psychological level. You have to do it at the interpersonal level and the community level and the national level and the international level. And what's the goal? Is the goal this? Do you get all of the entities to line up doing just exactly what you told them to do and what you want them to do and staying static and still? No. They're still scattered all over. They still have different roles. They still have different values. They still have different interests and needs. But they have an image of the future that is compatible. They have improved relationships so they're not fighting with each other. And everybody is working to some degree in parallel. If I were drawing this today, I wouldn't have all of those arrows going parallel, but closer to it than going every which way. And if everybody is working towards the same goal of a better society in which everybody would like to live, that's my definition of reconciliation. And the notion of massively parallel means that all of these folks are working roughly in concert, not directed by anybody, because complex adaptive systems can't be directed or run by anybody. If you have somebody who's in charge of a system, that means the system's complicated, not complex. In complex systems, you can have lots of individual actors doing their own thing, but they can work approximately in concert. So you get a system at the end where everybody does indeed, quote, live happily ever after. Now, whether or not we can really get to that point will be a matter that we'll be discussing over quite some time. But it does seem like a goal that's worth pursuing. We'll be covering more of this later. Thanks.